Hey everyone, welcome to episode 34 of The Green Life. I am super excited about today's episode as we dive into plant-based nutrition for families from babies to teenagers into adulthood with amazing Brenda Davis. And before we get into that, and before I introduce you to our wonderful speaker, I just want to mention our sponsor, Nama. Well, the Nama juicers have revolutionized the way that I juice at home and the way that everybody cold presses at home. It is the most amazing machine. The J2 is made to last, is really compact, and really makes the most amazing tasting juices. I put all the ingredients in there, walk away, and come back to the perfect breakfast. So for me, juicing is really part of my lifestyle. I love it. It has made me healthier by being able to get all these nutrients, and really moving from a centrifugal to a cold press has been a step up. So if you want to try the Nama juicers, and if you want to buy yourself one, if you need one, please check out the show notes for the website, and you can use my buying discount code, which is Chantal10 for a 10%. So enjoy it. Now back to the show. Brenda is a registered dietitian and is one of the leading plant-based pioneers and internationally acclaimed speaker. She is widely regarded as the rock star of plant-based nutrition and was referred to as the godmother of vegan dietitians by VegNews. She really did go into vegan nutrition before anybody else. Brenda has been a featured speaker at medical, nutrition, and dietetics conference in over 20 countries on 5 continents. Her most interesting adventures include a personal consultant lecture for a member of the royal family in Saudi Arabia and with Dr. Greger. So, great team. A lifestyle intervention demonstration project for the medical community in Lithuania, and also serving as the lead dietitian in diabetes prevention in the Marshall Islands. She'll tell us about the story for sure. It is amazing. She's also a very successful author. She co-authored and authored 12 books and has nearly 1 million copies in print in 15 different languages. I have here 3 of her most prominent work, which is Nourish, Becoming Raw, and Becoming Vegan, which really have changed the way that we understand nutrition, plant-based nutrition, that we can understand what we need, how to get it. It is awesome. So we're going to talk about mostly Nourish today, but we'll get into the other books because I think it's really revolutionary again that she really changed the way that we perceive veganism and how to do it in a very thoughtful way. Brenda is a force of nature. She is kind, she is beautifully eloquent, and she has so much knowledge. I cannot wait to dive into this. So without further ado, let's speak to our wonderful guest. Welcome, Brenda. Hi, Brenda. Thank you so much for joining The Green Life. How are you today?
Oh, hi, Chantala. It's really nice to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me.
My pleasure. I'm so honored that you made the time. You're a busy person, I know, and you are also, one of the people that I really look up to because I think that your work is fantastic. So having you here is a privilege. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people know you, especially in the plant-based community, especially as VegNews called you the godmother of veganism, or vegan nutrition, I should say. So if people don't know you, though, can we give them a little background about how you got into dietetics, but also how you actually shifted from learning a very standard approach to dietetics to actually going into plant-based? Because I think that was really the highlight of your career, right, in shifting.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. When I was in high school, I was very interested in all things vegetarian, even though I had never really met real live vegetarians or anything like that. It was something that appealed to me because of the impact on animals, and so I just thought it was almost a romantic notion somehow. The thought of being a vegetarian. But when I went to university, and this is the late 1970s, so 78 to 83 is when I was there, and it was really pounded into us that vegetarian diets were very risky, and vegan diets were just downright dangerous. They were considered extreme fad diets that shouldn't be used by anyone. And that was drilled into us over and over again during my university years. But I still found myself gradually shifting towards a more plant-based diet. And in 1989, I had been a dietitian for about 5 years. And I had an interaction with a friend that made me say, I'm done, I'm not doing this anymore, because I started to look more seriously at the big picture, at sort of the impact of our food choices on the environment, on animals, and on people. And so I just thought, I don't care, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to figure out how it can be done well. And I'm going to help other people who want to do it well. So that was my goal. I thought, I'm a dietitian, I should be able to figure this out. If there are nutrients lacking, then we need to figure out how to get them into the diet. If there, whatever potential pitfalls there are, we need to figure it out. There are lots of potential pitfalls in omnivorous diets. And so for many years, we added vitamin D to milk, we added iodine to salt, we added B vitamins to our, grain products. We did what we had to do to fill any gaps. And I thought we can do the same with plant-based diets. And plant-based diets have the advantage of reducing risk of chronic disease, of, reducing pain, suffering, and death, and of leaving a much softer footprint on the planet. So I just decided to forge ahead, and there were lots of roadblocks along the way, I can tell you. But overall, it was a really amazing experience.
Yeah, I bet. I actually heard from one of the interviews that you did about your experience with your friend, and I would love you to share that, because a lot of people have the same feeling about animals, and we see certain things, certain actions as cruel, but then we don't see our impact. And I think that experience was, it touched me. I was like, wow, yeah, of course, it made so much sense.
Well, it's interesting how often when we're young, we see animals differently and we connect with them so profoundly. I can remember, I'll tell you that story, but I have to tell you another story first. Mm-hmm. When my son was 3 years old, so this is over 30 years ago, we had been raising our children as vegetarians, right, from the get-go, and we were driving by McDonald's, and my son said, "Oh, mommy, there's a McDonald's. Oh, I'd love to try a McDonald's hamburger." And he was 3 years old. So I thought it's probably time to let him know why we don't eat McDonald's hamburgers. So I said, "Honey, the McDonald's hamburgers aren't the same as the hamburgers that we eat at home." I said, "The hamburgers we eat at home are made of beans and tofu." And I said, "The hamburgers at McDonald's are made of cows, and we don't want to eat cows." And he looked at me like I had just lost it. And he said, "Mommy, people do not eat cows." And so I thought, I need to tell them they do. And so I said, "They do." And he looked at me and he had tears coming down, and he said, "But mommy, them have eyes. Them have eyes, them have noses, them have mouths." He said, "Mommy, them have babies. Don't they know that cows are people too?" And it was this, revelation from a 3-year-old that these are sentient beings. He got that. He got that these are animals that feel, that love, that have babies, that all of that. And I was the same when I was little. I connected with animals very profoundly and cared about them a lot. And then you get desensitized as you become an adult, over and over and over again, as animals are served as sort of the normal food. And so this interaction with a friend, it was actually my friend who was on his way deer hunting, and he stopped by for a coffee, and I I just wanted to make him feel really guilty about going and shooting a deer. I thought, why is he doing that? The poor deer, what chance does he have against a big gun? And so I said to him, like, why do you do this? What is it, something to do with wanting to feel more like a man? It's like this macho thing. Why do you have to kill animals? And he looked at me and he said, the animals I eat have had a life. He said, I doubt very much you can say the same for the animals that are sitting on your plate. He said, just because you don't have the guts to pull the trigger doesn't mean you're not responsible for the trigger being pulled every time you buy a piece of meat camouflaged in cellophane in the grocery store. And it hit me so hard. I had no response. There was nothing I could say. It was the first time someone had challenged me to take responsibility for what was on my plate and to really look at, where my food was coming from. And so I vowed at that point that I was going to learn more about the animal agriculture industry. And so I just started researching, and everything I found in the next 2 weeks, it took me about 2 weeks to say, I'm out. I'm not part of this system anymore. I don't want any part of it. We can't do this. We just can't. As human beings, this is unjustifiable. Yeah. We have nothing that can justify what we're doing to these sentient beings. And I thought to myself, why would I cause this kind of pain, suffering, and death in other living creatures when I don't have to? I know I can put together a diet that is absolutely adequate without contributing to this kind of system of cruelty. And so that was really the big impetus for me. And so, yes, I think vegan, plant-based, whatever you want to call it, diets are better for human health in so many respects. They're better for the environment. But for me, really, the big impetus was wanting to contribute less to animal suffering.
Yeah, I mean, I must say, I made that connection after I went plant-based because I wanted to fix my health. And I learned nutrition from a very classical point, just like we were told, the vegan diets are crazy, and only hippies do it. And I had this resistance, and I always thought, but I eat healthy. I eat white meat. I don't eat red meat, really. I eat mostly fish. I eat a lot of veggies, and yet my cholesterol was too high. My blood sugar was too high, and I just never understood how. I mean, okay, I had eating disorders in my 20s where I ate really well during the weekend and binged during the weekend. That definitely didn't help. But for the most part, I wasn't having junk food. I wasn't having McDonald's. I wasn't having any fast food. And so I really didn't understand. And then I listened to a talk by Neil Barnard, who for the first time said, high sugar is not due to, or diabetes is not due to the sugar. And I thought, that's new. And I looked into it, and I start seeing all these researchers talking about the effect of high fats, or being overweight, and the high saturated fats and what it does to insulin. And I thought, okay, that makes sense. Actually, I'm going to try it. And I tried it with the caveat that for Thanksgiving we were going to New York, and I was going to have a little bit of turkey because I didn't want to offend my husband's mom. And for the first time that November, I tried meat after not having any animal products for 2 months. And I stopped cold while I was actually having that meal. And I thought, this is flesh. I never in my life had made that connection until my palate was clear of that animal taste. Wow. And after that, I was like, no, I can't do this. And I had cheese so occasionally anyway, because I was lactose intolerant, or I am lactose intolerant. So by May 2014, I hadn't touched any animal products, and I've been plant-based since. And then I learned about the animals, and I was like, oh my God, how did I not know this? Because I love animals. You know, I'm a dog person. I rescue every dog that I see. I'm just like, why did I not know this? And yeah, it's like your brain gets all this information, these inputs, and then you need that last synopsis to create that new pathway. So, you know.
I think, I think it happens so often when people come to a plant-based diet because of health reasons. They're able to hear and feel the sort of the animal arguments as well. When you're eating animals, you almost can't go there because it makes you feel like an immoral person. And often people, most people that eat animals are very moral people. They care about their families and their environments and all of that. They care about all of that. And so they just can't go there. It's too hard. But once you stop eating them, you can go there and you begin to really see that big picture. And it's very inspiring to hear your story, Chantal.
Thank you, Brenda. Now I'm gonna segue from the point that you made. You know how to eat properly a plant-based diet so that it gives everybody what they need. And so I like to dive into your book Nourish, because this is a Bible. It needs to be in every home, especially if people are parents and they want to raise a plant-based family, because I think there are obviously things that we need to pay attention to. And I would love you to give me some highlights about all these steps of life that can really, how to do it, basically, how to go from an infant to a teenager, being plant-based and being healthy. Because and obviously we don't have to go into every details, otherwise we can be here for hours, but which I would love, but I know you don't have a lot of time. But also people need to buy the book. And just to give them like an insight, because a lot of parents are afraid of changing what they've always known, because we are raised obviously knowing, our grandparents or parents were telling us, if you don't have meat, you're going to be iron deficient. This is really good for you. You're not going to have enough protein. And so it's one thing to do it for yourself as an adult, and one thing to have then this responsibility of a baby that now has to grow, and you don't want to impair their growth. So if we had to take it from step one, pregnancy, for example, how would you go about it? What are the highlights for every stage of life?
So I would say what we need to recognize is that during adulthood, the number one goal is really reducing our risk of dying of the diseases that kill probably 70 or 80% of us. Those sort of lifestyle-induced diseases like heart disease and diabetes, or type 2 diabetes, and many cancers, and so on and so forth. And so the emphasis is really on maintaining a healthy body weight, and of course, meeting nutritional requirements is important as well. But the big focus for most adults is that, reducing our risk of chronic disease. So it tends to be a message of eating less of the harmful foods and more of the healthful foods. Now, in infancy and childhood, the focus shifts a little bit, because during these growing years, the number one goal is ensuring adequate growth and development. We don't want to compromise brain growth. We don't want to compromise skeletal development, muscle development, and so forth. So we focus much more on ensuring nutritional adequacy. Now, we do want to instill healthy eating habits that will reduce risk of disease over the long term. And so that's really important too. But the number one is making sure this diet is nutritionally adequate. And so parents do get really concerned that there are nutrients that might be lacking. And the reality is plant-based diets generally are much, much better at reducing risk of chronic disease. But when it comes to nutritional adequacy, there are some nutrients for which there are a greater concern. And those nutrients are vitamin B12, which are not present naturally in very many plant foods. There's a little bit in some fermented foods. There may be a little bit in some, chlorella or some of these sea products, but generally we can't rely on these foods as sole sources of B12. We need to make sure there is a reliable source of B12 in the diet, which means supplements or fortified foods that are fortified with B12. And vitamin D tends to be a little less prominent in plant-based foods than in, we add it to dairy milk, it's in fish and eggs. And so some of the main sources, yes, it's in some mushrooms that are grown with natural light, but that's not going to provide enough for most people. So we need fortified foods or supplements, but most people actually do need fortified foods or supplements, even omnivores, to get enough vitamin D. We need, especially in Europe, there are some pockets of Europe that have very low levels of iodine in the soil. And so again, iodine tends to be common in fish. And of course, the most concentrated source is seaweed, but there aren't that many cultures that use seaweed as a staple like they do in Japan, for example. And so, iodized salt is a very rich source, but a lot of people eating plant-based don't purchase iodized salt. And so they need another reliable source. And so those are some key nutrients. But then there are also things like people worry about protein and iron and zinc and, omega-3 fatty acids. Many people think you can only get that from fish. And so there are all of these other nutrients that come into play as well. The other thing to think about with, growing children is getting enough calories. And so in Europe, there tends to be a big concern about the fiber in plant-based diets and it being too much for small children. I think that's overblown. I think children can manage a reasonable amount of fiber. And in fact, in the United States and Canada, we suggest 14 grams per 1,000 calories, even for children. And so it's a reasonable amount of fiber. What you don't want to be doing is sprinkling bran on your kids' foods. Just fiber in whole foods tends to be at a reasonable level. So if you're providing a good varied mixed diet, usually fiber won't be overdone. It's the concentrated fibers we need to be careful of. But by the same token, if children are growing too slowly or not, getting enough calories, one of the things that we can do is to provide some more refined grain products as part of the mix, maybe some white pasta or something like that, to lower the fiber content and increase the caloric density of the diet. And things like tofu are wonderful because there's very little fiber and a lot of protein, and it's very concentrated in calories. Nuts and seeds, nut and seed butters, avocados are all wonderful choices and should be a part of a balanced, varied diet for kids. And then, so for infants, the big thing is to provide an appropriate milk. And so, of course, the most appropriate milk for any mammal is their mother's milk. And so human breast milk is the best milk for human children up to, normal natural weaning age, which is 2 to 4 years. So that's the length of time that we would suggest a child being breastfed. Some people may think it's absolutely crazy to be nursing a 2 or 3 or 4-year-old, but that really isn't unnatural for humans. It's very natural for humans to be nursing for that amount of time. And by doing so, we're providing a child with the most wonderful nutrition, with a boost for their immune system, and so on and so on. And so that's what I would recommend. Now, if there's the mother can't breastfeed for whatever reason, illness or medications or whatever other reason, there may be, then a commercial infant formula is what is recommended. No homemade infant formulas. They're just not adequate for infants. And then when a baby is weaned off of breast milk or formula, an appropriate alternative milk is necessary. So it's formula or breast milk, at least for the first year. We would recommend it for the second year as well, especially breast milk. But it is considered acceptable in the second year to go with a full fat fortified soy milk. So a soy milk that's fortified with calcium, vitamin D, and vitamin B12 would be a suitable milk for a small child. And we need to be a little bit cautious about some of the non-dairy milks. Never use an unfortified non-dairy milk as a primary milk for a child. They need the calcium, and the B12 and the vitamin D. So a fortified milk is what we would recommend. Almond milk, cashew milk, oat milk, all of those milks tend to be very low in protein. So they shouldn't be used during the first few years, but if they're used later, then it's really important that we make sure the protein is coming from other places because they're very low in protein. The other milk that I would recommend avoiding is rice milk. Rice milk during the early years, because of the arsenic content. Actually, some rice milks are quite high in arsenic. And because children tend to have a lot of milk, it can exceed sort of upper limits, the recommended limits. So I would steer away from rice milk. And rice milk also tends to be less nutrient dense than other milks. The one thing that I do, and I would suggest if you're using a milk that isn't soy, like almond or hemp or cashew, is you can actually blend in. I have a Vitamix, so it works really well, but blend in hemp seeds. So I would blend in like a half a cup of hemp seeds into a couple of liters of milk, or even 3/4 of a cup of hemp seeds. And it makes the milk a little creamier, but it also boosts tremendously the protein and the omega-3 fatty acids and all of the other nutrients, to the extent that it would be comparable to soy or even better than soy in many respects.
Amazing. When it comes to formula, what is the standard formula? Is it made from cow's milk and then
Yeah, so generally the recommendations of pediatric societies are cow's milk formula for all infants except for those that are vegan or who have problems with digesting lactose. And then soy formula would be the recommended formula. So it's generally either cow's milk based or soy milk based. And a lot of people are worried about, the adequacy of soy milk formula, but it really is pretty safe and adequate. The only concern I have is that it is higher in aluminum. And it's significantly higher in aluminum than the cow's milk formula generally is. And so there are other formulas that are high in aluminum too, some of the hypoallergenic formulas and so forth. But that's the one, issue. And so it's not recommended for preterm infants for that reason. But for full-term infants, it is considered to be safe and acceptable. And of course, some women do have access to breast milk, banks of breast milk, and that would be, of course, a preferable choice to formula, in my opinion, but it can be very expensive. So that is prohibitive for many people.
Yeah, of course, which is crazy. If somebody has an abundance, it shouldn't be that expensive.
No, exactly.
What about, you said obviously the best solution is to have mothers breastfeeding. And I love the fact that you mentioned up to 4 years, because as you said, many people think that's a long time. And also society has been putting so much stress on mothers to breastfeed that I think a lot of them are struggling to actually even breastfeed a little, because there is so much pressure. And also for a while in the UK, there was this big thing about mothers breastfeeding in public places not being appropriate. I mean, conversations that really shouldn't even be conversations. Like, you're breastfeeding, it's fine. Like, but it was interesting.
It's
And
really
I think,
unfortunate. Yeah.
yeah. And I
think that we need to change that sort of view of breastfeeding, because I think mothers should feel very free to breastfeed in public. And I think that we need to teach that from a very early age, that this is a natural, normal, mothers can definitely feed discreetly, but it should be absolutely, babies need to eat. And so they should feel very free to breastfeed in public, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Especially when we have the freedom of having very voluptuous women showing their breast on posters and magazines and in the streets. And it's like, what's more appropriate here, actually, if you really want to go down to it. So I think, obviously the mother's breastfeeding is very important. So how important is it that the mom is well nourished, obviously, because now she's feeding the baby? So what would you say mothers need to consider when they're breastfeeding in terms of caloric intake as well as nutrients intake?
Yeah, so, when you think about it, all of the calories for the first 6 months of a baby's life are coming from the mother. So generally we have some reserves from pregnancy, some fat reserves, but still the mother's caloric intake needs to be probably, if you calculate it all out, using up some of the fat stores and the extra, for a lot of mothers, it would be an extra 500 calories a day or so. And the diet, we really do need to be sure to be eating a very balanced diet. And if you're breastfeeding, you definitely need a source of B12. You need to get enough iodine. It's shocking, but a lack of iodine in an infant is the most common cause of preventable brain damage in children. So it's something that's a little bit frightening, but we really need to make sure the iodine's there. Even a marginal deficiency of iodine, just suboptimal intakes, can cut a baby's IQ by 10 to 15 points.
Wow.
So this isn't something to mess with. There are certain nutrients that even if you eat all of your beans and grains and fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds, that you may not get enough of. And those nutrients are B12, vitamin D, and iodine. And so you really need to either, continue to take a prenatal supplement or take a supplement that provides those nutrients, or make sure you're eating sufficient fortified foods. And you could do a combination of the two. You could have, B12 twice a week and a little bit in fortified foods, and you would be getting sufficient. So we just need to make sure that we're doing that well. And of course, all of the specifics are provided in books like Nourish and Becoming Vegan and those kinds of resources. That's, I've written, I just finished my 13th book, and it's on plant protein.
Congratulations.
And thank you. And all of these books are really written to help people ensure that they get what they need to enjoy optimal health at every stage of the life cycle. And so Nourish, we really focused on families and ensuring adequate nutrition in growing children. And that's what we consider the most vulnerable years. So those are the years of growth. And so as we're feeding children, it's breast milk for the first 6 months. And then after that, we start to introduce a variety of solid foods. And it used to be that we used to think nuts and seeds you don't serve until a child is like 2 years old or something, or 3. And of course, in safe form so that they don't choke, like nut and seed butters that are mixed with other things and so forth. But we now know that, like peanuts, for example, we try to introduce peanut powder or peanut butter in some forms as early as possible, because the earlier the introduction, it seems the lower the risk of allergies long term. And so we really want to be providing mixed diet. So we start off often with, and this may sound a little questionable to a lot of people, but in Canada and the United States, we recommend iron fortified infant cereal, because here are the RDA for 7 to 12-month-old infants is 11 milligrams of iron. Well, the RDA for a full-grown man is 8 milligrams of iron. So you can imagine, for a tiny baby compared to a full-grown man, we're saying get about 1.5 times more than an adult male. Well, good luck on just feeding. People say, well, feed them beef. Well, baby beef, strained baby beef, you'd need to eat about 79 tablespoons to get 11 milligrams of iron. Iron fortified infant cereal, you just need 6 tablespoons. It's a reasonable amount. And so it makes it very easy to meet the RDA for iron if you add in these iron fortified infant cereals. And then you add in vegetables and fruits and, of course, legumes. And because we wait till 6 months to start solids, babies can handle all of those foods. So, you usually start one at the time to make sure they're not allergic, but they can definitely handle all of those foods. And avocados and nut and seed butters and creams. The thing with nut and seed butters is they can cause choking. So you would dilute them with milk, or you would add them to other foods before serving them, so that they're not going to cause choking. But so basically, you're looking at the way to say, is my child getting a complete meal? Is you want to be providing foods from every food group in a meal, or most food groups. So you might have some sort of starchy food, whether it's grain or a starchy vegetable, that provides, helps to provide the energy or the calories a child needs. You would want to provide a source of protein. So it could be tofu or tempeh or beans, lentils are all wonderful sources of protein, iron, and zinc. And then you would want to be providing some vegetables. And in the vegetable group, you're looking at color and variety. So maybe 2 or 3 different colors of vegetables if you can, and then some fruits. And fruits are, a wonderful source of vitamin C and potassium and so forth. And as I mentioned, the nuts and seeds, which are sources of essential fatty acids. And so those in the appropriate forms at various ages. And so that's what you're trying to get into each meal, if possible. And even snacks. This is important because children have small stomachs. So for a lot of adults, we're looking at eating 3 meals a day and trying to minimize snacking, because we tend to get too many calories. And it's easier to control calories when you're eating less frequently. But for children who need more calories because of their tiny little stomachs, it's really important that we're providing snacks between meals. So they may have 5 or 6 meals in a day, and snacks, we would, want to make the snacks balanced as well. So you don't have to provide something from every food group, but if you're serving apples, it might be with some nut cheese or some nut butter or something like that provides a little extra calories and nutrition. Mm-hmm. And then beverage wise, the fortified non-dairy beverages and milk are really the way to go for beverages. We don't need juices. We don't need any sweet beverages. We really want to focus on water as a primary beverage, and then any non-dairy milks are appropriate too.
What about homemade juices? So if a mother is making a homemade juice, whether that is a mix of different leaves, maybe with some fruit to make it sweeter for the kids, would that be appropriate? Would that be something that would be encouraged, or you prefer not to give any juice at all?
I think those can be a good addition. I think they, especially if they're primarily vegetables, It removes some fiber. It makes it very easy to get more of the phytochemicals into the small child's belly. So using leafy greens and beets and carrots and those kind of things with just a small amount of fruit like apple or something like that. I tend to suggest whole fruits more than juice fruits. But if you're doing fresh, like let's say you've done a big hike or a bike ride or something, I don't think having some citrus freshly squeezed is necessarily a bad thing. I think it can be a wonderful, enjoyable beverage, especially post exercise.
Yeah, brilliant. Now the diet you describe is obviously beautiful because it's whole foods and it's plants. And I have a question about oils. So we talked about the good fats to add in, whether they come in form of avocado or nuts and seeds. What is your stance on oils? Because I know when we talk about whole foods, we're talking about unprocessed, and obviously there's a big discussion about olive oil, for example, being quite processed because in nature you don't find the oil. Yeah, I like your take on that. And also, if you think that olive oil is something that is okay, would that be okay for children?
Yes. So generally, when we're talking about adults, especially adults at risk for chronic disease, we want the foods to be as nutrient dense as possible. We want every calorie to be providing something of great value. And oils tend to be the least nutrient dense of the foods. So they don't provide a lot of nutrients per calorie. A tablespoon is 120 calories. So very, very nutrient dense food. And when you think about volume of food you're eating, whatever you're eating, the oil poured on top doesn't add to the volume of food. So it doesn't feel like you're eating anymore. It's just adding a lot of calories. Now, oils to me have more redeeming value than some sugars. So, for example, white sugar has very little to offer in any respect, whereas a high quality extra virgin olive oil or avocado oil or something like that will provide phytochemicals, vitamin E, vitamin K. It will provide some value, but it will also help with the absorption of fat-soluble nutrients. So vitamin D and the phytochemicals in the salads and so on are the plant foods. And the carotenoids are fat, they need fat for absorption. And so there's that redeeming value in these oils that it can help in those respects, whereas sugar does almost nothing. Unless you're talking, blackstrap molasses or some sugar with some value. But standard white sugar is of very little value. But for adults, as I mentioned, who are trying to reverse disease or prevent disease, I would say get most of your fat from nuts, seeds, avocados, whole plant foods. For children, I would say generally we want most of the fat to come from whole plant foods because it provides vitamins and minerals and essential fatty acids and all of that. So use liberally avocados and nuts and seeds and nut and seed butters and all of those things. Oils, I don't think we should say are poison. They can be part of a healthy diet, especially for a child that you're having a hard time getting enough calories into. So without changing the volume, you can add 120 calories by adding a tablespoon of oil in the diet. And it doesn't change that volume of food so the child can get in more calories easily. And it can help with the absorption of those nutrients, as I mentioned. So what I would suggest think about your culture, your tradition, what foods you traditionally use. If you really enjoy using a little bit of olive oil, I think that's a perfectly fine thing to do. I wouldn't use it excessively because it's a lot of calories with not very many nutrients. So again, you still want most of the fat to come from whole foods. But if you enjoy a little bit of olive oil in the hummus or on a salad, I think that is an option, especially for children who are underweight and, or who are healthy, active children, and adolescents as well. I think we need to be careful about being too rigid. We need to take into consideration cultural practices, traditional foods, favorite foods, and so forth. And then within that context, to use, maybe smaller amounts of the oils. And then for people who are struggling with reversing disease, I would make a bigger effort to get those oils out.
Yeah, I did that actually. So now we don't have, I grew up obviously with an Italian family, so olive oil, you use it for everything. Like even if you are upset, like you're gonna have to put it on you and be like, I'll feel better. So I stopped only last year because I had this emotional attachment to it, but I had to, because one thing I didn't mention is I got myself healthy 10 years ago almost, when I became vegan. And then after 8 years, I basically got myself sick again. I went through this project that I mentioned before the recording was so stressful that I think I just had all these shifts in emotions and not having my routine anymore in London and coming here and finding myself in this new space, having to navigate a lot of stuff that came up. And then I think going into perimenopause also didn't help because I had those like emotional bursts, like the dark night of the soul, if Dr. Northrop calls it. And I just found myself not paying attention to my diet. Like I always really was proud of myself for being so happy to eat the freshest food because I really love food. And then I started eating things that were vegan, but hyper processed. And so I gave myself type 2 diabetes. And I also, in a year, like less than a year, which I reversed in a year as well. But one of the things that I did is that I really committed to not having any oils and just also minimizing any other fat even. I was having some avocado, I was having a little bit of tahini, some flax seeds. But honestly, I just decided to be quite hard with the approach because I didn't want to be sick. And I managed to lose weight and I'm 100% now. And that really got me to think, wow, we can make ourselves so healthy and we can make ourselves so sick. But also it took me to that place where when I talk to a lot of vegan people that maybe don't understand the importance of plant-based, we can get into real deep, like pitfalls because they not only going to be nutritionally depleted by the time that they, have done this for a few years to go, they also are going to jeopardizing their health. And I think it's really important for us to educate people about the importance of whole foods because we don't want to have a community of vegans that are sick because then that becomes vegans are sick. And that's not the case. It's just because they're not doing it right. Like an omnivore can do it wrong. So
I love that. I've been saying for many years that, failed vegans that don't do well because they're not conscious of their choices, are become exhibit number one for why people are justified eating meat. So if you care about animals, you need to take care of yourself because we are on trial in the eyes of the world. And for many people, you're the only vegan they know. You are what vegan is judged by. And when you blow it, when you end up with B12 deficiency or whatever it is, they point their finger and say, see, I told you, we need meat. Humans need meat. Mm-hmm. And so we just need to figure it out. We need to get it right. We need to do it well.
Exactly. And so when it comes to children, then obviously when they're home and the parents are mindful and they have your book and they feed them very well, what happens when they go to school, for example, and they're surrounded by non-vegan friends, and also they might, start trying things that perhaps they don't have at home, like the more processed cakes and snacks. What is the approach for a parent, and what do you think it should be the balance? Because obviously it's going to be quite difficult to control, but also you don't want your child to feel like an outsider, I guess. What do you suggest?
It's hard.
Yeah,
it can be really challenging. So what I did was I took the easy way out. And I mean, but back then it was even more unusual to be plant-based than it is now. But what I did was I just explained to our children why we ate the way we ate. I explained to them about nutrition, about the animals, about the environment, all of those things. And I said, at home, this is what we have, and this is why, basically. When you're out, when you're at a friend's house, when you're at school, you will have choices to make about what you eat. And that's up to you. You can decide to eat something or to not eat something. And you know, you have to make that decision yourself. And we won't, you know, say you can't eat something. It's really, you need to own your food choices. And it was interesting because my son a couple of times ate meat. I remember he went to a friend's house for a barbecue and they were roasting pork and he had some and he came home and he said, asked me what kind of animal that was from. And I told him it was from a pig. And he probably cried for 2 hours. He just kept saying over and over, I ate a pig. I ate a pig. How could I have eaten a pig? Why did it? He was 4 years old and he was just, he said, I'll never do that again. I'll never do that again. And he just owned it. And he just, you know, really reinforced his own strength to make choices that he felt okay with. And so I think that in some ways it can be really empowering for a child to be able to make those choices for themselves. But all that having been said, you also don't want them to feel sort of left out. So one of the things that you can do is when you know there's cupcakes being served, you send a cupcake, or you send, you know, cupcakes for the class. You know, people can't tell the difference between a vegan cupcake and a regular cupcake anyway. And so you just, if they're going to a birthday party where they're serving burgers, you send them, you know, a burger for the host to cook for your child. And so just always make sure that they have those options. And I think that generally tends to work pretty well. It's just a little more work than what other people have to do. But that's, you know, and I think it's starting to change. You go into so many places now and there's burgers being served. Half the time there'll be plant-based burgers available. So it's really starting to open up, and because there are more people that are making this shift, it's getting easier, thankfully.
Oh, yes. And, you know, I also saw that a lot of countries are at government level are actually stating that a plant-based diet is appropriate for all stages of life. But I think Canada really does stand out in the sense that they've taken the next step towards dietary guidelines, which a lot of countries haven't. Can you just tell me what the difference is between what it was before and what is now in terms of exposing or highlighting the plant-based choices?
Yeah, so Health Canada develops, you know, like many countries, sort of national dietary guidelines and these food guides. And our food guide has morphed over many years to take different forms. And the latest rendition came out in 2019. And the big change with Canada's food guide in 2019 was that the government decided to exclude industry influence from the guide, from the guide and the dietary guidelines. So they, you know, this is quite unusual. Most governments are heavily influenced by industry, and they decided that these guidelines would be entirely evidence-based and not influenced by stakeholders such as industry. And so the guidelines ended up being quite shocking, actually. And you know, Canada's food guide has always been, you know, sort of 4 food groups: fruits and vegetables and grains, and meat and meat alternates, and dairy products. And this latest guide is a plate half the plate is fruits and vegetables, a quarter of the plate is grains, and a quarter of the plate is called protein foods. And the protein foods, there's a great emphasis on choosing plant-based proteins every day. Nice. And choosing mostly plant-based proteins. And so it's beans and lentils and tofu. They also include some dairy products and some meat and fish and poultry and all of that in that group. But there is no dairy, there's no designated dairy group anymore. And beside the plate, there's a glass of water, and the glass of water is drink, make water your beverage of choice kind of thing.
That's brilliant.
And so, so it's a food guide that can be vegan, it can be lacto-ovo vegetarian, it can be omnivorous, it can be whatever. But there's definitely a huge push in the plant-based direction. So the plate is, it's 75% plants, and then the other 25% is, protein, make it mostly plants, and animal products are there if you so choose. So it really is a very progressive plate, and I'm really proud of what Health Canada has done in this guide, because it's a guide that I think is it's setting an example for the world.
Absolutely. Were you participant as a consultant to this change?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And we had many opportunities to let our voices be heard. And so we actually, my writing partner, Vasanto Molina, and myself, we made several, statements and, with Dietitians of Canada on our own. And then Vasanto had the opportunity to talk to the Director General of Health of the sort of program and of the Health Canada Nutrition Department. And she gifted him a copy of Becoming Vegan. And he said she spoke with him after, she gave him a call and asked him how it was coming in. And he said they really used the book and appreciated the extensive referencing and said it made its rounds at Health Canada. And they, one of the points that we made very strongly is that having a designated dairy group is really, in a lot of ways, some people would call it racist or not inclusive, because there is a great percentage, probably 70% or 68 or whatever percent of the world's population that's actually lactose intolerant. And those people tend to be people from Africa, people from Asia, people who are often already, marginalized in North America. And so we really made that point and said that these are not essential foods, and they should not be a part of a guide making it seem like they're essential foods, that they've got their own exclusive food group. And so they were very sensitive to that, I think. So anyway, it was tremendous progress.
Yeah, definitely a step in the right direction. And you mentioned something about sugar, and I'd like you to just clarify some things, because a lot of people, there was this trend for a while where people were like, white sugar is bad for you. We can have fructose because fructose is like what comes from fruit. Meanwhile, that's not the case. Could you clarify that point for people, especially if they're now trying to give more fructose products or fructose derivatives to kids, for example, to not have them get the white sugar?
Yeah, well, white sugar is half fructose. It's half fructose, half glucose. Fructose and glucose are, the main sugars that you'll find in foods naturally. The fructose is something, however, that's metabolized very differently than glucose. And I won't get into the details of fructose metabolism, but it's metabolized very differently. When it's extracted from foods and concentrated, and added to sweet beverages and processed foods, it tends to overload the body's capacity to use it. And it can increase our risk of, fatty liver, for example, and lipotoxicity, where we store fats in places they shouldn't be stored. And so it can have some profound negative effects on health. However, the amount of fructose that's naturally present in whole foods like fruits rarely exceeds our capacity to metabolize it. Because it's dilute. So if you imagine the average piece of fruit might have 6 or 7 grams of fructose, a 20-ounce bottle of soda might have, 25 grams of fructose. So it's much more concentrated, and it takes a lot longer to eat an apple than it does to, drink a soda pop. So we just, fructose is not poison. It's a very healthy sugar when it's, when it's innate within, intrinsic to, I should say, fruit or vegetables or other whole foods, it's not a problem. It's when we extract and concentrate that it's a problem. And so what we want to do with our children is to encourage them to eat lots of fresh fruits and vegetables, but not a lot of highly processed foods that will have a ton of fructose added.
Yeah. And with the escalating issue with childhood diabetes, what are your if you had to give 3 top advices to parents and physicians even, what would your top 3 be, like, to actually decrease that problem? Because it's becoming a pandemic. Like, everybody seems to, I see it here in Portugal, for example. I see 2 issues here: overweight children and children that are being put on antidepressants very early, or ADHD medication. And when you look at what they eat, it really does come down to that, for the most part. Of course, there are some exceptions. So what would your top 3 suggestions be to mitigate this issue?
Number 1 is encourage physical activity. I mean, we need to keep our kids active. Reducing screen time, getting outside as a family, playing, running, jumping, biking, swimming, whatever you can do, be physically active. And part of that would be other lifestyle, consistency in sleep routine, drinking. Well, I'll include that as a separate thing, but all of these, fresh air, exercise, adequate rest, all of those are very important. Number 2 is to minimize highly processed foods of any shape or form. Packaged, crinkly packages, whatever. And that doesn't mean you can't have fun treats, but, instead of having a sugar and fat laden store-bought ice cream, make the frozen banana ice cream. Instead of these ice cream bars with chocolate on top, you can freeze bananas on a little stick and brush, some dark chocolate or chocolate nut butter, combination on top, and make a treat that way. So make your own treats. If you want to do some crispy potato thing, you can do it in the oven or in a air fryer or whatever. But to try to really minimize the intake of highly processed foods. And then number 3 is to not drink calories. It's one thing to drink, a vegetable juice or have a smoothie as a breakfast, part of a breakfast or something like that is okay. But otherwise, you want your liquids to either be your non-dairy, mostly water, or the non-dairy fortified milk for children. And that's it. You don't want them to be drinking sugar at all. And so if I name 3 things, those would be the 3 things. Now, I guess if I were to add one more thing, I would say the foundation of the diet should be unprocessed whole plant foods with plenty of legumes and fruits and vegetables and intact whole grains as much as possible as the foundation.
Yeah, and I want to just add one last question that I want to tie in both with diabetes and whole foods. So I know that you were a consultant in the Marshall Islands for diabetes, and you created the program. So I would love for you to actually expose why we have this problem in places like the Marshall Islands, or had this problem in the Marshall Islands, because I've seen it in many islands in the Caribbean by visiting, that some populations happen to just step away from what they used to eat, and as soon as they change the diet, disease appears. What did you find the biggest catalyst for diabetes in the Marshall Islands was?
Yes, so the Marshall Islands are, a very small population, about 60,000 people in the middle of nowhere. I mean, there's nothing within thousands of miles in any direction. And of course, being island people, they lived off the land for many generations. They ate, fish and plants pretty much. That was the bulk of the diet. And whatever plants they could collect, a lot of coconut and pandanus and, breadfruit and things like that. And what happened was, with progress, I guess, they ended up with way more people on these islands, especially on the main islands, than what could be sustained. Because the Marshall Islands, the main island, Majuro, is it's a coral reef. There's not a lot that grows there, and so it might sustain 1,000 people, if that. And there's 30,000 people on the island. So there's no way they can live off the land anymore, unless they ship things from some of the other islands or whatever. But also the people are poor. There's not a lot of employment. And so they end up shipping in the cheapest processed foods that money can buy. So ramen noodles, white rice, Spam, a lot of shelf-stable foods, and white flour products and that. So they switched from, living off the land. And of course, when you live off the land, you're physically active because you have to work hard to spear fish or to climb a coconut tree and get those coconuts. You're working very hard all day. But when you have to just go in the grocery store and buy this highly processed food, there's not a lot of work, physical work involved. And so the diet shifted from, plants and fish to, white rice, white flour, sweet drinks, high fructose corn syrup drinks, and Spam and other fatty meats. And so it's really, a formula for diabetes. You've removed fiber, you've added a bunch of processed stuff and cheap oils, cheap sugars, cheap flours, and it's a formula for diabetes. That's all there is to it. And so these islands often have the highest rates of diabetes on the planet because of that kind of transition of trying to acquire inexpensive foods for, the population. And it's very just absolutely tragic to see the changes in the people.
Absolutely. I love that, because we actually identified this common denominator in behavior. If we don't eat whole foods, disease comes. If we step away from a more traditional approach even to how getting our food, disease comes. So it's that mindfulness that we want to keep, right? Just like the blue zones have maintained it. And actually a question that I had for Dan Bittner, who I hope one day will come on the show, is, what is the long-term vision for the blue zones? Because one thing that I think about is that the youngsters want to move towards technology, want to leave the place where they were born. What happens to these communities? Because now we're talking about aging people getting over 100 and over 100. I mean, they won't live forever, even if they live a long time. So that would be an interesting anthropological study.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see what's happening in some of the blue zones, because Okinawa, for example, many of the young people have gone away from the traditional dietary patterns and are eating a bunch of processed foods, and they will no longer be a blue zone if that continues. And so I know Dan and his team are encouraging communities all over to become their own blue zones and to encourage it's not even just diet that defines a blue zone. It's lifestyle. It's being moderately physically active all the time. It's having a sense of community and connection. It's having strong families. It's not smoking. It's sleeping enough. It's all of those things that make for a truly healthy community. And Loma Linda is another of the blue zones, but I think they have a little better, cultural practice there, in that it's affiliated with the Seventh-day Adventist community, and so there's that great encouragement to eat healthfully as part of their culture. So it's they may be a little more protected because of that. But it will be very interesting to see what's happening in Sardinia and in Icaria, Greece, and the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, and how much they're changing, and if they're able to retain their blue zone status as the seniors, as the people that define that blue zones begin to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, just thank you so much about this, because it is amazing. So this book is great, and I also have your other Becoming books, which I must say, not only do I love the Becoming Vegan because it breaks down nutrition in a way that is so clear, but I love that you wrote Becoming Raw, because for the longest time, I have really struggled to find anything that can, speak about the science behind raw food, because there's a lot of people saying a lot of things, but it's not a very well tested, studied way of life or diet pattern, because nobody really took the time, I guess. I don't know. It's just nobody put the funds towards it. And I love that you actually really broke it down, and there is, what it does, what it doesn't, so that it demystifies these myths. And I must say, it's also very brave to write a book, because this wasn't just now. So raw food now is kind of more normal, more approachable. People are more aware of it. But at the time, it was something that definitely nobody really wanted to touch. And how did you have this idea of going into the raw food?
Well, it wasn't our idea at all. It was our publisher's idea. And our publisher said, there's so much controversy about raw, and, we really need a science-based book to answer those questions. And my writing partner and I didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. We said, it's considered, such a fad diet and so fringy and all of that. And but we discussed it for a while, and we said, what, we might learn something if we really dig into this and try to figure out what's true and what's not true. And it was probably the toughest book we've ever written. It was a big challenge. We contacted experts all over the world to try to address some of the claims made within the raw food community, and to see if they had any basis in science at all. So it was very interesting. And we also experimented a lot with raw foods on ourselves, and incorporated permanently several of the wonderful ideas that the raw food community has. So, overall, it was an amazing experience to write this book, and we learned a lot. And I think that we have a lot to learn from that raw food community. They do a lot of preparation techniques that are quite brilliant, like the soaking and dehydrating of nuts and seeds instead of roasting, and methods of preparation that don't produce so many products of oxidation, which is really wise. But the thing that I would say about completely raw food diets is they are highly, highly therapeutic. For people with disease, for disease reversal, they're hardcore diets and they're very fruit and vegetable focused. So they tend to work really well for disease reversal. But they're so far on that end of the spectrum that they're not as safe, I would say, for growing children. And so I would be very hesitant to suggest raising children on completely raw food diets because they're less energy dense, and children with their small stomachs, it can be hard to get enough calories into them. And also the nutrients of concern become even greater concern with raw food diets because there are fortified foods. So the calcium and vitamin D and all of those things can be more of an issue. So, and even protein can be more of an issue because they're legumes, legumes really, especially large legumes, they need to be cooked. That's all there is to it. Some of the small ones can be sprouted like lentils and such, but they're not as high necessarily as easy to digest for some people. So with a child, I would suggest, yes, include plenty of raw foods, but it also have the cooked beans and tofu and all of those kinds of things as well.
Great suggestion. Thank you for that. I'm actually enjoying having more raw food, but I'm not fully raw. And I do feel the difference. I must say, sometimes if I eat too many cooked meals, I feel it. There is something about eating raw food, like beautiful big salads, and that is just uplifting. But I also do need, but I also need completely. That warmth sometimes, especially as the seasons change. There's nothing that beats a soup. So it's nice. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Brenda. We ran out of time, but this was such an inclusive and beautiful chat, and I love your work. Thank you so much for putting out there. And when is your new book coming out?
It will be out in April of 2023. It's gone to press. The press is printing is taking a long time these days, but it will be out in April. It's called plant-powered protein. I'm trying to remember what we ended up deciding, but plant-powered protein, I think, is what we went with. And so it's really all about the questions people have about protein throughout the life cycle, protein for athletes, all of those things. And I wrote it with Vasanto Molina, my co-author for Becoming Vegan and Becoming Raw. And my son actually did a chapter in this book as well. He did the environmental chapter. So
that was fantastic
to have him.
Yeah, well done. I hope that we can get together again and talk about the book. I will definitely get it. So I'm really excited.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the wonderful work you're doing, Chantal, and thank you so much for having me as your guest. I really appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you everyone for staying on for this episode. I really hope you learned a lot from it and that you can see that a plant-based diet, when it's well designed, can really be the perfect diet for us humans. And now more than ever, our actions really have a huge impact on our environment and our animals, and compassion is the most wonderful cure for this planet, for the state of our planet. So please do check out Brenda's book, especially Nourish if you have a family, because it would really help you navigate how to stay healthy, so that you can also educate your doctors and you can really educate your friends, and most of it, you can be healthy for years to come, because us being healthy also means that the planet is healthy. We are really connected to nature, as we said in the show, so let's really take care of it and ourselves. So guys, if you like this episode, as always, please share it, review it, and give us comments so we can improve. And of course, I will see you next week. Bye.